buildings are antiques, this antique.
Well, certainly the building is a piece of our history.
Regardless of its shape and form, it's a wow building.
You know, Berkshire Athenaeum, I think, is a wonderful building. It's such a, it anchors that side of Parks Square.
I think everybody just loves the building. They love coming in here and doing the work. And it's very admired, the architecture, the history of it.
Buildings like this are a big part of downtowns, of preserving the history of the area.
The building itself from the outside is so beautifully preserved and so exquisite in its design. And I felt that the use of it was good to preserve a building of that nature and that stature.
So when we see a building like this is really special, and people will, will travel to Pittsfield to see it.
The first time in many years that I came through Pittsfield, I drove by that building, and the old Athenaeum building really stood out to me as just being unique.
You mean when they built the new Athenaeum, there was talk of getting rid of it, and the state picked it up, and generally when the state picks something up, it's because it's got a bunch of liabilities.
And what's happened on some of these buildings that were built more than a century ago, when they start to have a weak spot or some spots where water starts to get in, especially here in New England with the freeze-thaw cycle we have, and the water gets in and it turns to ice and it contracts and expands and contracts, keeps pushing that masonry out. And so it starts as something small with water infiltration, can grow and grow, and the stone veneer starts to get more and more out of plane, and it's leaning forward away from the building.
You know, we had some plaster falling and some cracks, from the shifting of the front of the building. And back in the 80s, they noticed this was happening. So they did some supportive metal bands that seemed to work temporarily. And then they noticed a little bit of the bowing happening and some shifting and larger cracks and more of the ceiling coming down. And the stained glass windows in the front were shifting and breaking. Parts of the stained glass windows were breaking out.
It seems like this one's been more brewing, that they've noticed that there's been problems, that when people look up at the building and they see cracks, they say, I think, is that crack bigger than it was last time, or how much movement is actually occurring out there? And it sounds like there were some really good studies done maybe 2 or 3 years ago where they come out and did 3D imaging of the whole north facade. And they were able to build some computer models of that and figure out that certain areas of the facade had up to 6 inches of displacement, which is a ton. So you're talking about stones leaning more than 6 inches away from the building they should be.
So that whole process, that takes at least a year, just to get the project defined, scoped, they call it, and then budgeted, and then authorized to begin.
We went back into that area and did a project very similar to this. Document the existing stones that we could, start to do a dismantle, take down the backup wall, build a newly reinforced structural wall that meets today's code. And then the big thing that ties the new projects and makes them look like the old projects is what happens behind the scenes. It's the mechanical ties. Physically putting steel metal anchors into the masonry that connect back to a structural wall so that they can't pull away over time. The two are really locked together.
The large stained glass windows on each of the front gables presented their own set of challenges. While not overly elaborate, they each had 23 panels set in concrete tracery. Removing the stonework meant removing the glass panels as well and replacing them in precise molds of the tracery. The work commenced with the same kind of written and photographic documentation. These windows had only had temporary fixes to the broken glass since 1876, when the Athenaeum was built. Taping the windows ensured the glass did not fall when the panel was lifted. Once removed, the panels were restored and transferred to David Guarducci's studio in Great Barrington.
And you lay paper over the window, and then you rub it, and it gives you an outline, a tracing outline of the panel. And that's like a map. Afterwards, now you can go ahead and take the window apart, dismantle it, tray it, completely rebuild it on top of one of these drawings.
The rubbing's been taken.
and took it apart, and now it's being cleaned, and then it'll get trayed, and it'll get reassembled.
And David is now reassembling a window on the working drawing. So he'll set up ledgers and begin to rebuild this panel on this drawing.
70% of the cost in this job is labor and 30% material. For our newer jobs, it is almost an opposite swing of that. So, looking through some numbers of even how many different people will be employed in a project like this, we're probably going to see at least 50 different skilled craftsmen come in and off the job over the course of a year. On average, there's probably 6 to 8 men on site, and those crews change. There's 10 to 15 different subcontractors on this job, and it's definitely has an economic impact on the area.
In this case, I mean, the state has really, it seems, gone out of its way to really provide a lot of information, at least to our local, experts, which in this case would be our local historical commission. Yeah, the city played a big part in the restoration of the Colonial Theater and the Beacon Cinema and other projects through various mechanisms. I mean, we have a tax increment financing program that has gone into some of these buildings. We've also been able to utilize, we have a GE economic revitalization funds. I mean, those have been used for some of these projects. So the city does have, or has had a role in several of these projects that have been successful in preserving buildings downtown.
This would be, could have lots more lives to it other than probate court.
It still has a great deal of charm to offer. To me, it does. I always think what a crime it would have been if they had taken that building down.
From an overall historic preservation perspective, I mean, this is it's a very important project that we didn't lose this building and have it replaced with something more modern and not as unique, not as really a landmark fixture. This building is